infants and young children. And on a personal note, I have a 1.5-year-old right now, so I'm in the thick of this issue and seeing a lot of great examples in my daily life. So Debbie and Bobby asked me to talk about language development this time, and that's something that I really think is super interesting. There's so much going on and so much you could talk about. So what I'm going to do today is just sort of outline the trajectory of language development, starting with even before you're born, prenatal development, things that are going on prenatally, and then talk about the first couple of years, which is the main focus of language development. So what we learn to comprehend first, and then we learn to produce. And then I'll talk about where that comes from. So are we just sort of pre-programmed to learn language, or what has to be present in our environment in order for us to develop language normally? What can help or hinder language development? And what parents can do, because parents are caretakers. What are people doing to help babies figure out this incredibly complex problem of language? And I'll talk a little bit at the end about baby sign language, and that's kind of been a new, not that new anymore, but it's been definitely a trend that more and more parents are utilizing some basic science with their children and how that ties in with the rest of their language development. So starting with just, kind of some basic definitions I'll be throwing out throughout the talk. So when I'm talking about language, obviously we sort of automatically think about spoken language, and that's sort of when I think about language development, you see a child going from babbling to starting to understand and say their first words. But language is really composed of lots of different things. So it can be spoken, but it can also, of course, be written. We can talk about sign language. The main things to say that you're talking about language is that you have some sort of symbolic system of words that stand for something else, and that you can combine them in lots of different ways. So rules, so we understand, if an adjective comes before or after the noun, depending on the language that you're talking about, that it's describing that particular noun, and that we can infinitely generate new ideas and sentences. Using this system of symbolic language that we all share, I can say something that you've never heard before. I can just come up with an idea, and I can have a way to express that idea so that you understand what I mean. So we're not bound by a set of ideas with this symbolic system. We're able to express new ideas. We're able to communicate things and share understanding. So what we'll talk about today is that that includes two big parts when we're talking about language development. First, you have to understand. And then you also need to be able to produce. And if you've ever tried to learn a second language or foreign language, you may notice a difference there, that maybe you're a little bit better at kind of picking up words than speaking it back fluently. Or maybe you can speak the words, but once somebody starts talking really quickly, you lose that comprehension. So there's two main components to this problem of language development. So the story starts before we're even born. The story starts in the womb. Infants start to respond to sounds fairly early during prenatal development. They hear a loud sound about halfway through the pregnancy, and the fetus can sometimes respond to that. And what we know is that there's a lot of noise going on in the womb. They hear the mother's digestion, the mother's heartbeat, breathing, but probably the loudest thing is her voice. Right? They're hearing it externally and also internally, kind of resonating through her. And so they get a lot of exposure to language before they're even born. And a lot of studies have started to show this, and to show that language learning is actually taking place in the womb. And one of the ways they show this is they take these brand new newborn babies, and they do what's called a high amplitude sucking procedure. So newborn babies don't have a lot of ability to, say, yeah, I've heard that before, or, even really move to look at where a voice might be coming from. But one thing that they can do is suck, right? Newborn babies have a reflex to suck on a nipple, a pacifier, a bottle, a finger, whatever's kind of put in their mouth. And they can learn really quickly to suck at different frequencies to hear a different sound. So this is really cool when researchers figured out that they could do this. Now we can sort of get inside the head of a newborn baby. So they would hook a baby up with some headphones and this pacifier that's hooked up to the headphones. And if the baby sucked at a fast rate, they'd hear one voice, and if they sucked at a slower rate, they'd hear another voice. And they can train the newborn babies to figure this out, and that they can put in, 2 competing soundtracks and see what the baby prefers, right? What they'll choose to suck at the rate to hear. And so with this procedure, they found that a newborn baby, just in the first days of life, will prefer to listen to their own language, the language of their mother, than a foreign language. They also prefer, particularly their mother's voice, they tend to prefer female voices, so they have this familiarity already built in for their native language and for that sound of their mother's voice. They've also done studies where the mother during the 3rd trimester would read the same story every day. So The Cat in the Hat, I think, was one of them that they used. And then they would test the baby, the newborn baby, to see if they preferred to hear the familiar story or a different story. And they don't really know what's going on in the story, but something about that rhythm and that sound of that story that they heard in the womb, they would suck at the rate to hear that story that they had heard. So, we now believe that this is the very beginning of language development. You're already starting to tune in to the rhythm and sounds of your native language. Some researchers even say that newborn babies start to even cry differently. They cry in the rhythm of their native language. And I think that would be really hard to distinguish between a lot of newborn baby cries, but with enough data and enough research, they're starting to see these different patterns. They're already starting to imitate the sounds of their native language. So we have this big shift happening over the first year of life when it comes to phonemes. Phonemes are the basic sounds of a language. So once they've kind of tuned into the rhythm of their language, they start to now distinguish the different sounds. And what sounds are meaningful differences and what aren't? Well, that differs depending on what language you're learning. For us, the sounds with an R and an L sound very different, and they mean different things. If I say, you're going to take a left at the next light, or you're going to take a right, or light. Those are totally different words, and we interpret them different ways. But in other cultures, like the Japanese, they don't really distinguish between those sounds. They've done research where, I think I have a clip here I can show too, with different languages that have a difference that is meaningful for their language, but not for English. We as adults just don't even hear those differences anymore. But babies are set up to learn whatever language they're exposed to. So during the first year of life, during the first half of that, babies show that they're able to distinguish between any difference in these phoneme sounds, whether they're going to be used in their language or not. But by the end of that first year, they've lost the ability to hear the phonemes that aren't in their language. So some babies may be learning, 2 or 3 languages at a time if they have many languages spoken in their household. But whatever ones they're not being exposed to, they sort of lose that ability to distinguish those phonemes. And that actually, it makes sense and it's helpful. If you really paid attention to every difference in sound, and somebody said cup and somebody else said cup, and they said it slightly different, and you thought that were 2 different words, that would make it a lot more complicated to figure out, where you make these boundaries for the different sounds that you're paying attention to. The way that researchers study this is another procedure. You've got to be kind of creative with infant research. So this one's called the conditioned head turn procedure. So this is infants who are a little bit older. They're able to turn their head, so 5, 6 months to a year. And they basically, so they're sitting on the parent's lap, and the parent has headphones, and the experimenter has headphones, so they can't hear what's going on. So they can't signal or cue to the infant, what they hear. And they're playing through the speaker a stream of phoneme sounds, so syllables like ba, 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 and then at some point it will change. So maybe it's going ba, 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 pa, pa, pa. And if the infant hears that change, they've been trained to turn their head because there's going to be a rewarding stimuli off to the side, usually a toy that moves or lights up or makes some sound. So what they want to see is if the child will turn their head in anticipation of that toy lighting up because they heard the change, or if they don't notice the change, they'll turn their head after the toy starts moving in response to that. So that's just sort of set up what you're going to see here in this clip, and let's see if I can get this to work. Do you have the internet?
Yeah, should be able. I don't know if we've got sound plugged in.
I mean, we don't need to see it if it's too much hassle, but it's basically that same procedure that I just explained.
Oh, well, we've got sound here.
flexibility to learn any language. The obscure Indian dialect spoken here is helping psychologist Janet Worker discover when babies lose that potential, when in fact they begin to master.
Can you guys hear it all right?
You hear it a little bit?
We can hear it a little bit. Can you just
I can't find the cable with the sound.
Turn it up.
turn the laptop speaker up a little bit, maybe?
Language is useful to me because it has a set of consonants that are not used in English, and that English speakers cannot discriminate between.
I don't know how to turn it up on here.
Worker records these consonant sounds to pinpoint a critical period of development, the point when babies exposed to English can no longer discriminate among Indian sounds.
So first off, what I would like you to do
Sorry,
is
just check
help
that
me think
before.
of some words that are used in the Thompson language that differ in only a single sound.
Can you turn this on?
Oh, it's complicated.
All right, well, we can maybe skip it.
I think
I wasn't prepared for this.
This is how their language sounds. There you go. You got it.
You want to go back?
Yeah. All right, I'll just go back a little bit here.
Some words that are
So she's using
Can no longer discriminate.
this tribe of Native Americans who have a language that has sounds that mean different things, so phonemes that are meaningful in their language but not in English. And so she can record those sounds to use for this conditioned head turn procedure, which you'll see in a minute here.
Discriminate among Indian sounds.
So first off, what I would like you to do is help me think of some words that are used in the Thompson language that differ in only a single sound. Oh boy, those sound the same to me. Now, can you say those again?
That's try.
Okay.
And to secure, maybe you're secure your pack or whatever.
Okay, can you say this word, this one I've written down here, which means to fry, and then pronounce the first consonant and vowel 3 times, very slowly.
Kegem. And then the other word is kegem. That's to secure. Kegem. Ke.
Now they're going to switch over to the experiment, and you can see if you can notice when the sound changes as the infant does. So she just heard it. But for us, it probably couldn't tell, right?
We teach the baby to turn her head when the sound changes. In testing, we can then tell if the baby can hear the sound change because she turns her head in anticipation of the toys coming on. The toys then serve as a reward for correct head turn.
This 8-month-old baby has no trouble anticipating the appearance of the toys. She turns when she hears the sound change. This baby is a year old. For him, the difference in sounds no longer exists. He only turns after the toys have appeared.
There's a reorganization in speech perception across the first year of life, so that the young infant is born ready to learn any human language. And experience then functions to narrow that universal set of abilities, that universal discriminatory ability, to be specific to the particular language that the baby is learning.
Exposure to the environment commits some neurons to forming useful networks. We become better at one language as we lose the ability to perceive others.
All right. Oh, there you go. Okay, so yeah, so I love that clip because it's so clear that the first child's able to just turn her head, she hears the sound, she knows that the reward's going to happen. And the second child is only turning once he sees something's going on over there. Right? So there's this reorganization, like she said, in our speech perception, with our perception of phonemes. And it's remarkable that we're born ready to learn whatever language we're exposed to, and then we start to narrow down those phonemes that we pay attention to the point where we can't even really hear them any longer. And of course, with extensive training, if you were to learn that language and really tune your ear, you could learn it. But we'll talk about there's really a sensitive period in the first 7 years of life that you are still more able to pick up on different languages, and then it's a lot more labor intensive when you try to learn them later on.
So we should all learn foreign languages.
I should have taken that in high school.
Yeah.
I didn't.
A lot younger.
Right? The earlier
Yep.
that you are exposed
Yep.
to language, the easier it is to learn. That has been shown over and over again. The sensitive period we'll talk about, around 7 years, makes it, without any kind of language exposure, makes it really difficult to learn later on. We've all learned at least one language, so we're set up good that way. That it's easier for us to learn a second language now that we have one. But really, children pick it up much more naturally than adults do.
Are there any languages that are harder for kids to learn? Like, even though that's where they grew up in, like, say, is German or Russian harder?
That's a great question. I don't think so. I mean, there are languages that are tonal that may take them a little bit longer, but they really, if that's the language that they are growing up with, that's what they learn, So, and there's variability between infant to infant. Some kids will start talking before the first year, some don't talk till close to 3. So it's hard to say that there's particularly a language that would cause that to be longer, but yeah. And kids who are bilingual, so if you grow up in a house where maybe your mom speaks English and your dad speaks French, typically they take a little bit longer to develop language just because their problem is a lot more complicated, right? They're learning 2 at the same time. But then they will be fluent in both of those if they keep hearing those and being exposed to them.
What causes, my great-grandmother came from Switzerland,
Yeah.
and she could speak, I didn't know her, but she could speak the French and the Schweizerdeutsch, Swiss, German, and she went to school in France, so came to America way back. So I was going to say, like my great aunts, they had kind of that little broke, that language. They were born in America, and 2 of the older ones were born in Switzerland.
Yeah.
So what causes that when they have that broke language? I mean, they have that foreign dialect.
So when did they learn the...
Probably learned at home, And the mother, grandmother kept the language at home. She didn't want to learn English.
Yeah.
That's way back.
Yeah.
But then again, my dad's cousin said, well, she knew those languages because in Switzerland they had 4 languages, and I think there's the Italian too. She probably knew it too.
And she probably learned them as a young girl too, so
Yeah.
so that really helps you learn.
That was a long time ago.
Knowing this stuff, and I thought, I'm definitely going to start teaching my kid a foreign language, but you got enough on your plate with a new kid to start learning if you don't already have it. And that's why some people will, hire. I have a colleague in New York who hired a nanny who speaks Spanish, and so the whole time that she's taking care of the child, she speaks Spanish. And so there's ways to try to give your child that leg up.
Does that confuse the child though to somewhat too if they're too young?
I mean, they pick it up so naturally.
Because I always wondered, and this sounds really
Yeah.
dumb, I know, my wife always says, but I always wondered like shows like Daria or even Sesame Street that has a lot of bilingual in it.
Right.
If that somewhat is confusing to a child at 2 or 3 watching that.
Right, I mean, you're giving them different labels for the same
Yeah.
words, right? You're saying
And
this
that's
symbol
what I
and this
thought.
symbol both mean this.
Yeah.
But kids, they can understand that, they can pick it up. I mean, especially, they might sort of mix them up at first, but a friend who has a child who's French and English, this little 2-year-old was talking to me, and I said, what? Because I didn't understand what she said, and she just immediately switched into French and repeated the same thing. So they do start to have these kind of systems of, this is one and this is the other, and, they don't seem to have a lot of errors where they switch, but, I mean, the bilingual language development is definitely a really interesting question, area of study, and what I do know is that because the problem's a little more complicated, it may take them longer, and there may be some some errors, but they do eventually kind of set those two systems and
So it probably wasn't a good thing that I turned off Daria every time it came on when my son was watching it, because I was scared he would learn.
You didn't need
I
to be
mean, I think a lot of
paranoid.
the Spanish I know is from Sesame Street. So,
That's
you know.
right, right.
I was different too, so.
And then they start to, pick up and keep some of those phonemes too, if they keep hearing some of that stuff. So, yeah, so it's great discussion. They start to have comprehension, obviously, before they can produce. Like actually producing words takes a lot of different muscle coordination between your lips, teeth, and tongue and larynx. But they start to show understanding of words very early. Around 5 months, they can start to, look at, say, the cat when you say kitty or something like that. The basic words that they have heard a lot. Around 7 or 8 months, this new skill that they start to develop called joint attention really helps them learn a lot more language. Now, this is understanding that when I'm looking at something and pointing at it, that you should also look there. This is what I'm talking about. That's what joint attention is. By about 12 months, they're starting to initiate it, where they'll point and want you to look at something. And just that ability to share attention with somebody else on an object helps parents, caretakers say, oh, this thing that you're holding, that's a cup, or that's a ball. And then they start to kind of make those connections. So that's a big social skill that can help them with this problem of language.
And those of us working with kids or with families, that what's critical about that joint attention is the parent has to be willing to respond to what's interesting to the child.
Yeah.
It's not about what I'm doing. I'm cooking and I'm drinking my coffee or whatever. It's that you are holding the block, or you just pulled the kitty's tail. So if the parent can get outside themselves enough to
Focus on
right,
Exactly.
what is that child looking at through his or her lens?
Yeah. And before they're about a year or so, it's hard for them to shift attention from what they're looking at to what you're looking at. So you might say, hey, look at this, look at this. But I mean, you're going to do a lot better by looking at what they're paying attention to and labeling that and talking about that, and then eventually they get that reciprocal. So we start communicating, right away we can communicate when we're born. But the only thing we can really communicate is, I'm in distress, right? So the first noises that infants can do is crying, and they don't even really make a lot of happy noises in those first month or two. But they do definitely have this distress signal. And you can start to differentiate between the different types of cries pretty early on too. Pain cry or tired cry or hungry cry. They start to eventually, differentiate more and more. Then finally they're able to start making a little more noises that are just expressing pleasure, so these are called cooing. It's not quite babbling, but it's just kind of like little sighs and gurgling noises that they can make to let you know that they're enjoying whatever's going on. And then around 5 or 6 months, we start to see what's called babbling. Now this is actually starting to experiment with the sounds of their language, some of those phonemes that we were talking about. So usually they're very repetitive. They get kind of stuck on 1 or 2 sounds for a while, and they're just learning how to use their voice, basically. So things like ba, 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 da, 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 ma, 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 ma. These sounds that are just kind of a consonant and a vowel. And people who study language, linguistics, people can actually differentiate between a babbling child who's raised in a German household versus English versus Mandarin, because they're actually experimenting with the sounds of their language. This isn't just random sounds. It's sounds that they've heard. So then those magical first words start to appear, usually around 10 to 15 months, or around the first birthday is usually a good way to remember it. And those first words are usually familiar toys, animals, food, vehicles, household items, greeting terms, hi, bye. Now they may have made sounds earlier on that sounded like mama and dada, from maybe, as soon as they start babbling, they're making these noises, and a lot of times people will say, oh, that's their first word, but when they actually start to say it in reference to the thing that they're, supposed to be talking about, like when they say mama when you come in the room or when they look at you, that's more of the, kind of first word. Although it's really hard to kind of put a marker on, like that was the first time they used language. But around the first birthday, they're starting to, start to reference things with sounds that start to sound like the words that they're trying to say. And then we get really a lot of development going on later in that first year, or second year. So around 18 months or so, they're starting to now put words together. So my 18-month-old will say shoes on, lights off, you know, those sorts of things. So it's called telegraphic speech, that they're not saying full sentences, but they're starting to combine words to give you the basic meaning of what they're trying to say. And then we've got this awesome vocabulary spurt, where it's like something clicks in their mind, and they all of a sudden realize that everything has a label and a word, and they want to learn it all, and they start just saying back words that you've said, or the last word in your sentence they'll say. And so they go from about 50 words at 18 months to 200 words by their second birthday. By the time they're getting into first grade or kindergarten, they've got thousands and thousands of words. I read a statistic that said that they're learning on average from 2 to 6 years, 1 word every waking hour on average. They're just soaking it up, right? So they go from this very limited vocabulary to all of a sudden, where did you learn that word? You've got so many words that they're working with. So it's really cool. And one thing to point out with this trajectory of language production that I've just gone through is that we see the same thing for deaf children. They actually babble and experiment with sounds, experiment with their hand gestures in a very similar way that a speaking child would with language as well. So we see the same kind of progression and a sort of similar time frame, although because hand gestures are easier for kids to pick up than vocalizations, they might be actually a little bit ahead of a vocalizing infant in this trajectory.
May I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Try to, okay, like with the social media, I mean the older children, so that's developed faster, hadn't it, with all that some are exposed to, some are not, you know. Will that make a difference too?
Yeah, so
is there research on that?
with infants and stuff?
Oh, past the infants.
Yeah. So as far as language development goes?
Maybe, yeah, that's what I'm wondering, because I think it would.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
they need real voices, real people, real humans, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean for this stage for sure. And I think a lot of it's so new that there hasn't been a lot of longitudinal research
I wondered about it
on
now.
that, but I feel like just kind of anecdotally that, with the text message and like the fast kind of responses that we give and the short and abbreviated, that we're kind of losing some of that
We're losing it.
fluidity
I think so,
and
too.
fullness of language in a
I feel the same
sense.
way.
But, and I'm not for this,
Yeah.
but you'll see people give their phone or the iPad to a child, like, and there's voices
Right.
back and forth. Now you said they needed real people voices, so are you saying then they really don't learn to repeat those sounds or
They
voices?
can learn to repeat them, but I had a note about this at the end that that's called passive learning, when they're watching a screen, when they're watching television or interacting. And research that has directly pitted, we're going to have these kids watch a screen, we're going to have these kids talk to a parent or talk to an adult, found that the vocabulary after just a few weeks of that, for the kids who had the
Adult person.
reciprocal interaction with just their vocabulary was a lot larger than the kids who had the passive. So even these shows that are marketed to help children learn language, like Baby Einstein, that was what the study was actually looking at. It's exposure to language, yes, but it's not as good as actual face-to-face interaction time. That's where they're actually picking it up because they're just hearing words, and we live in a world of words. So we're hearing words everywhere. You hear it on the TV, you hear it at the supermarket, you hear it everywhere you go. And so they're picking up some information from that. But to actually learn language, they're better off having that interaction with, absolutely, with real people.
I think
reading
so.
You're not
books,
replacing
pointing out
people,
things.
not replacing
No.
teachers,
No
none
way.
of that is
No
gonna
way.
be.
Say, my son's learned some really good language off YouTube videos. So.
Yeah, language is evolving. Just to kind of shift into the next part where I'm talking about what influences language development. I've kind of talked about the trajectory and what happens over the first couple of years. So why does it work the way it works and what goes into it? Well, obviously we're set up to learn language in some ways. We are the only species that really uses language in this special way that we do, right? Infinite generativity and rules and grammar. Lots of animals communicate. Lots of animals can learn, a set of 50 to maybe even 200 words. Dogs can learn commands. Chimpanzees can learn sign language to a certain extent, but no species has language like humans have language. So there's something unique about our brain, first of all, something unique about our genetics that allows us to solve this problem to think in this way. So there's two areas of the left hemisphere of the brain that seem to be specifically involved in language. So there's Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Wernicke's is right in the temporal lobe, which is our hearing part of the brain, so our left hemisphere. And that seems to have to do with language comprehension. Broca's is in the motor cortex, so that's the part of the brain that controls our motor actions, and that is involved in language production, so being able to produce it by coordinating all the muscles to speak. And researchers have figured out that these areas seem to be involved because when you look at cases where these particular areas get damaged, then we see deficits in those areas. So people who have damage to Broca's area often have trouble speaking, and people who have damage to Wernicke's area have trouble understanding language. So there's some really specific parts of our brain. The prefrontal cortex, which is involved in a lot of abstract thought and problem solving, is also involved, but these tend to be very specific centers that researchers believe are designed to learn language. Now I mentioned the critical or sensitive period before 7 years, and so it's believed that it's not just totally innate, it's not just totally genetically determined that we're going to learn language just because we're human. We need to have some sort of environmental exposure to language. Now this is something that's really difficult to study because A, you can't do animal studies with this, right, because animals don't have language, and B, it's unethical to deprive a human of language, right? It just doesn't happen. And so the only cases that we have are these kind of sad case studies where there are children, because of abuse or neglect, have been basically deprived or had very little exposure to language. This is a girl, Jeannie, who was found at 13. She'd been basically locked in a closet and beaten for making any noise, and she hadn't had, hardly any exposure to language. And she was making, like infantile kind of cooing sounds when they found her at 30. And through extensive years and years of training, she eventually started to learn some words, but it was very similar to what you'd see in infant learning, but it took her years to even get, a basic set of words. And even after, even by the time she was in her 20s and 30s, she was still sort of having issues with grammar and being able to put those words together. So we know it's harder to learn a second language later on, but it turns out that it's even really hard to learn a first language with no exposure or very little exposure over that first kind of sensitive period where your brain is, ready to soak up that information. So it's sad when we see cases like this, but it really kind of shows us the importance of that environmental contribution of people talking to you and being exposed to language in your
You
environment.
weren't here for our introductions,
No.
but what you're saying is very interesting to me now. Because of the age you said you learned English.
Yes, I
Your story, you were here, so.
Yeah.
my parents didn't speak in English to me until I started school, and then I learned through ESL teachers.
And how old were you when you started?
I went to preschool, so that's when it started, but my mom said that my teachers complained that I didn't speak at all until I was about 7.
Yeah. But you
So I'm still learning.
Yeah. So what language did your parents speak then?
Vietnamese.
Okay. So you did have one language,
Yeah.
which definitely helps. And then the
Yeah.
fact that you started learning English before you were 7 is probably why you're so fluent now.
Yeah, because Debbie made the comment that she doesn't even have an accent. Then you're using the 7, and she said 7. I thought,
Yeah.
this is a pretty good real life correlation right here in front of us, that we got.
I've
So
lost Vietnamese. So.
You've lost it.
Oh, you have?
Yeah. So it's the same sort of like if you don't use it, you lose it with like any
Yeah.
kind of skill, after enough time. If you probably try to learn it again, you'd learn it a lot quicker than you do the rest of it.
It's understandable, but I just can't keep my family.
It is.
I
Yeah.
just respond to them in English.
That's cool though, yeah.
but there's a case study sitting here.
Yep.
That's a much more pleasant.
That's a private one. But yeah, that's the last two things to come are grammar and pronunciation. So if you can learn it really early on, your pronunciation, if you learn it later, you're probably always going to have some kind of accent or something that gives you away that it's not your, fluent first language. So as far as the environmental influence, like I've already mentioned, we are surrounded by language. It's very rare to find somebody who's not exposed to language. Even if your parents aren't speaking to you all the time, you're hearing, sounds at the supermarket and on the TV and all of that. So infants are naturally little sponges set to absorb, language. And so part of what they're doing is they're little statisticians. They're taking all of this information, all these sounds, and they're parsing it apart into, okay, I hear pretty baby all the time, and I hear the sound, the end of the end of that word and the beginning of the next word. How do they know that's not one word? They start to, hear baby in other contexts, oh, cute baby, pretty baby, oh, does baby want to go to sleep? And they start to hear that word and they start to pick it out and say that must be, its own separate unit. And maybe not actually, consciously thinking that, but they start to recognize those words. And there's a researcher called Jenny Safran at the University of Madison who studies this, and she'll actually have adults and children come into the lab and she'll play them a stream of nonsense. So it's almost like you're go to a foreign country and you're just listening to this stream of sound. People don't make stops between each word and they don't necessarily, break between sentences. But if you are exposed to enough of it, you can start to pick out familiar words and phrases. And so she's shown that even with just a stream of nonsense, people will start to pick out those words, maybe not even consciously, but if you play a familiar word from that stream of nonsense or a made-up word that wasn't in there, they can tell which one is familiar. So that's basically at the same level what babies are doing with English or whatever language they're learning. They're starting to parse out those words just based on the sheer amounts of data that they're getting, all of the language that they're exposed to all the time, starting before they're even born. So there's other things that we sort of naturally do, or maybe naturally or we, consciously do. One of the great ones is called infant-directed speech, and you've probably noticed people do this, and I'm not talking about baby talk, but I'm talking about the way your voice changes when you talk to an infant or a child. What are some of the things that we do with our voice?
Goes higher.
Okay, we change the pitch of our voice, right? Hi! What else?
Slower.
We slow down, right?
The eye contact sometimes is different too.
Okay, yeah, we maybe make our faces more animated, definitely.
Sometimes we don't speak a language anymore. We just start making noises, so.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. So we change the pitch. It tends to be higher. People have studied, looking at the voice clips of how I talk to an adult and how I talk to a baby. And so not only is our pitch higher, but it's going up and down. It changes pitch a lot more. So it's making it more interesting. We slow down. We emphasize words. That's a ball. Look at that ball. We repeat it over and over again. We pause between words. Think about if you learned a foreign language and your instructor would come in and say, "Hola, habla español," right? That's different than if you go to Mexico and they would just be like, "Ooh," right? So it's the same sort of thing. They're using kind of the tricks to try to help you learn language that we kind of naturally do, and adults naturally speak to children in this way. Sometimes we speak to our dogs this way too. But what it does is they show that infants prefer to listen to it, so it makes it more interesting. They'll listen longer because you're being more animated and interesting. And you're, emphasizing the words they know, you're making breaks between words, you're parsing up the language. So if they just had to listen to an adult's conversation all the time, it would be a lot trickier than this kind of really responding to their needs and helping them learn language by the way that we change our voice. We also really reinforce as they start to learn language. So as they're just kind of going through their experimentation with ba, ba, la, 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 da, da, all of a sudden, what happens when they stumble upon a word?
Daddy freaks out. Yeah,
He said da, da. Did you all hear that? He said it. It was his first word. Mama's first word, right? We get so excited. And so that's really reinforcing to a child when they're like, oh, what did I just do that made my parents freak out like that? I'm going to say that again, And so we're definitely reinforcing that as they're starting to learn words and label things. And so it's like a really fun game for them. And for us, we're just, you know that word, what's that? Pointing out all the familiar things that they know, a plane, a train, a ball, a kitty, look at all these things that we know, we can share this language. So it's really fun and it's really exciting, and something that, because it's exciting for us, we sort of naturally reinforce that. We do what's called imitation and recasting. So my son will say, tea, and we say, kitty? That's right, that's a kitty. We are understanding that he's trying to say that word, so we say it back to him. We don't say, no, you're saying that wrong. It's not a tea, it's a kitty. But we just, it's this really positive correcting of their language that we sort of naturally do. And then we do that later as they start to learn grammar and they said, I go to the park. And you say, oh, you went to the park today? You know, it's just saying back to them what they just said to you, but saying it, you know, more correctly, pronouncing it better, and changing the grammar. So there's a lot of this back and forth, and that's how they learn it too.
And it's kind of like as teachers when we say modeling.
Yes.
It's the same thing.
Exactly. Exactly. You know how kids imitate whatever we do, right? So they want to learn and to be able to speak it in the same way that we are. And so every time that they say it and you kind of correct it, they're learning through that. And then also just, you know, that kind of reinforcing back and take, give and take of, you know, having that reciprocal language interaction. Reading is a great example. You're telling a story, you can point out things in the book that they know, you can ask them questions, and especially familiar stories. You know, kids, it may seem annoying that they want to hear the same book over and over and over again. Well, they're trying to solve this problem of language, you know, and so they really like to hear familiar things, and it helps them to kind of go over the same things again and again to pick out those words and to pick out the language from that. So some things that as they're learning language, kids will naturally make some errors as they're trying to sort of categorize their world and to figure out, you know, okay, I've learned this new word dog, so does this just mean this specific dog? Or does it mean all furry four-legged animals? You know, where do you draw the line? So we naturally, as they're learning, you know, how liberally to apply these new terms that they have, we see overextension where, you know, they learn the word dog and then they call every furry animal a dog. Right now, every bug is a bee in my house. And then underextension where they learn the word dog, but then they see, you know, a dog that's a different breed and they don't recognize it as a dog, right? So having to learn those categories is part of language development too. We see them kind of naturally learning what's called morphemes. So phonemes were the basic units of sound. Morphemes are the basic unit of meaning that change a word in our language. So they very naturally pick up some of these things like, oh, if I want to say there's two things, I add an S at the end to make it plural or possessive. And it's interesting that they kind of go through these different stages where they would first correct for the words that don't follow the rule, like I ran instead of I runned. At first, they're just kind of repeating what you say, and they'd say, oh yeah, I ran. And then later on, as they're starting to learn the rules, they might make these errors and say, oh, I runned over there. So you might see them kind of using both as they're figuring out which words use the rule and which words are exceptions.
First grade, once when you'd see it.
So back in 1958, the researcher Jean Berko came up with this great way to just test, you know, if they are actually learning the rule or if they're just imitating words they've heard before. It's called the WUG test. So she'd say, this is a WUG, now there's two of them, there are two, and have the children finish that sentence. So a WUG is something she made up. It's not a word that the child's ever heard before, that's the point. So they couldn't have learned that we call two WUGs WUGs. So they're just applying the rule that to make something plural, you add an S. Here's some other examples. Now there are two WUGs, they both have hats. Whose hats are they? They are the WUGs' hats. And kids very early can pick up on these rules and show that they've learned them. So even words that, instead of just adding an S, you can add an ES, this is a TAS. Now there's another one, there are two TASes. And this is a man who knows how to rick. He's ricking, he did the same thing yesterday. Yesterday, he ricked. I have another just short clip showing some of the original footage of one of these tests, hopefully.
It's moving, it's thinking.
Yeah, it took a little bit.
There it goes.
Oh, let's see it now.
This is a line. Now there's another one. There are two of them. There are
To illustrate that what the child has learned is a grammar, and not a huge memory bank of phrases, Jean Gleason invented a test called the WUG test. This test shows how children can apply the rules of their language, even to nonsense words that they could never have heard before.
Now there's another one. There are two of them. There are two WUGs. Right. Oh, look at this funny one. This is a man who knows how to bod. He's bodding. He did the same thing yesterday. What did he do yesterday? Yesterday he bodded. Bodded, right. This is a gutch. Now there's another one. There are two of them. There are two. Right. This is a big who owns a hat. Whose hat is it? It is the Beck's. Now there are two Becks. They both own hats. Whose hats are they? They are the Beck's. Right.
Okay. So you can see, see the genie, that's the child who's in type of language development. It's coming up next. That closes. Oop, there we go. So they're actually, picking up on those rules. And again, you may kind of explicitly teach some of those, but a lot of those they're just picking up again from the statistical regularities of speech. So it's already 7:30, so I'm going to try to wrap up here. But
Thank you.
one way that parents have been learning to communicate infants is by using gestures or sign language. Now, this may seem like a kind of a newer fad, but it's really not that new. That, saying hi and bye are some basic signs that pretty much all parents teach to their young infants. And infants start to use hand gestures a lot earlier than they can actually vocalize. It's a lot, like I said, it's simpler. Around 8 months, they're starting to, do some basic gestures of pointing or waving. And so you can build off of that and teach some very simple signs, some things that might be kind of important for them to be able to communicate with you, and it can be helpful. Now, whether or not it's actually helping them learn, vocalized language earlier, that's, up for debate. It doesn't necessarily give them a huge step up, although it does start to teach them that everything has a symbol and a meaning. But what it definitely does do is make your life and their life easier, right? If they can't communicate to you that they want some water, or they want more, or that they're wet, or that they're tired, basically they just can freak out and cry and, show you that they're upset about something. But if they can say, I want more, I want milk, I want water, I need a diaper change, then it just kind of makes that communication a lot smoother between parents and kids. And so that's why this has really been catching on, and a lot of parents have been using at least a few basic signs. And the thing with this, it just needs to be something simple that the child can use, that you can start, using the signs with the words, as soon as you want. You can start very early as they're newborns to start every time you say the word more or milk or whatever words you decide you want to use. And they don't necessarily even have to be the correct American Sign Language for these words either, as long as you understand and they understand and everybody they're communicating with knows what that is. So, for example, this is milk, but my son has always done this instead, which is slightly different, but we kind of understand that that's what he wants when he does that sign. So it can make life a lot easier, potentially help them start to figure out this problem of language. So just to conclude from this talk, language does come naturally. As long as you're exposed to language, you will learn language. Infants are really highly motivated to be able to communicate. Once they start to talk, they really want to tell you everything that they know. And they pick up language very like sponges from their environment. However, there does need to be some exposure, and the more exposure, the better, and the more vocabulary we'll build, and the more fun they're going to have learning this. So they do need some exposure, like we saw, to develop normally, and the earlier the better for different languages. But parents naturally will do a lot of things that are, helping them learn. So, to give a talk and say, well, here's like 5 things you can do to help them learn language more. We already are doing a lot of those things. We already are using infant-directed speech, reinforcing their learning behavior, talking to them. But the more you can talk, sing, read to them every day, I know that's kind of your guys' platform, right? But just, it doesn't need to be this baby talk. Like I'll just, as I'm taking a walk, say, oh look, there's a dog over there. Where's he going? He's got a red collar on. Look at that big tree. Just kind of a stream of consciousness of what's going on. It's just giving them more data. It's just giving them more interaction, especially when you can, like you said, notice what they're looking at and label that and talk about that. You're really helping them out. Reading to them is great, limiting their passive language time. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends no screen time before 2 years. This is getting more and more impossible to actually stick to. You know, there's parents who take it to the extreme where like the kid can never see a television or a phone, but the reality is that parents have phones and TVs, and they're there. You go to a restaurant, there's TVs. You go, you know, to grandma's house, there's a TV. All the adults have their cell phones. They're going to see screens, and they're going to, you know, be exposed to that somewhat. But you know, just to be aware of how much screen time they're getting, and to not encourage them to sit in front of screens for a long time, because it actually delays language development more than helps it. So just to be aware of that, and you know, not need to stress out about it as I'm learning as a new parent, but just to be aware and to try to limit it and try to increase the amount of actual face-to-face interaction time that they're getting to help them learn. So that is all that I have for you guys.
Oh.
That's Kai.
That's Kai. That's Christine's son.
So if you guys have any other questions, I'm happy to stick around, but I know it's past the time that you were expecting to be here. So.
Well, thank you. Is she not just a wealth of knowledge? And it's awesome, too, that she's now taken research and is practicing it in the real world as a parent.
I'm at least witnessing it.
And no matter how much you study, it still can't give you as much as having your own child.
I know, and they throw those curveballs. Do you guys, do you need a clock hour? You don't need
Just as long as we got something.
You got it, something, okay.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.